The Degrees of Knowledge by Jacques Maritain. Chapter 3 Critical Realism. By the name critical realism, I do not here mean those contemporary philosophical ideas which, notably in America and in Germany, have adopted that title to characterize their position, but rather the Aristotelian-Thomist conception of knowledge. It strikes me as having a better title to the appellation. Etienne Gilson has raised an interesting and useful controversy on this theme by maintaining that though Thomist realism constitutes a methodic realism rather than anything naive, it can nevertheless only become a critical realism in conceding, at the very moment when it claims to strike them down, to the pretensions of idealism. Gilson's study is marked by many just and penetrating observations, and it excellently exhibits how vain is the idea of asking from the Cartesian cogito, conscious thought or reflective self-awareness. However many amendments one proposes in it, any elements of a realist noetic, a realist material epistemology. He who begins as an idealist, he writes, necessarily ends as one. It is impossible to be an idealist by halves. There is no need to doubt what history teaches by so many examples. Cogito, ergo res sunt, I think therefore things exist, is Cartesianism, that is to say, the exact antithesis of what is considered scholastic realism and the cause of its ruin. No one made a greater effort than Descartes did to throw a bridge between thought and things, basing himself on the principle of causality. He was indeed the first to make the effort, since he had obliged himself so to do, by placing the point of departure of knowledge in intuitive thought. It is therefore strictly accurate to say that every scholastic who thinks he is a realist because he accepts this setting of the problem is in reality a Cartesian. The Cartesian experiment was a wonderful metaphysical enterprise, marked with the purest genius. We owe much to it, if only for its brilliant proof that every tentative of this kind is doomed in advance to failure. But it is the height of simplicity to begin it again in the hope of obtaining contrary results from those which have always followed, because they are of its essence. One may begin with Descartes, but one will end along that road with Berkeley or Kant. There is an internal necessity in the very essence of metaphysics, and the progress of philosophy precisely consists in an increasingly clear consciousness of its content. No man will ever win from the cogito the justification of the realism of St. Thomas. Area dicta. Let us give thanks to a philosopher with such a rich historical background for this vigorous witness, in the name of history itself, to the intelligible necessities which, despite all the accidents of material causality, rule the historical development of thought. The criticism which he suggested from this point of view of idealism is exceedingly pertinent. History attests at once the essential impotence of idealism to pass on from criticism to positive construction, and for the preservation of the rightful content of philosophy as distinct from that of a chosen regulative science, and the necessity in which it finds itself of substituting for the real because it does not start from things but from thought. Rational, not real beings which are only false coin. It is certainly true, on the other hand, that though fundamentally and consciously realists in actual practice, neither Aristotle nor St. Thomas ever felt the need to qualify themselves as realists in the modern interpretation of the term, for the reason that the error to which it is opposed had not yet arisen in the West. But the realism professed by Thomas today is only a passage from the implicit to the explicit, and this transition is itself a form of progress. It is even possible to think that in this, idealism has played a necessary historical part, precisely because the aptitude with which our faculties for knowledge lay hold on the real is a gift of nature, and human thought, by the very reason of its native vigor, deals the more spontaneously with what is in the degree to which it is healthy. It needed, so to speak, the pathogenic ferment of the Cartesian cogito, and the aberration of the way in which idealism posed the critical problem to compel the philosophical intelligence to turn seriously to its consideration and to enter consciously into a phase of self-reflection, which in itself, whatever the cost needing to be paid for it, must add to the fuller manifestation of the spirituality of the reason. If idealism is in itself a tragic experience for thought, which, like all veritable tragedies, ends with the suicide of the protagonist, it also opens, on condition that it itself is entirely turned out, together with a new problematic, new possibilities of depth and penetration, which the mind cannot renounce. It is important, therefore, to avoid here a double-sided danger. One, which consists in accepting, in whatever way and however little, the idealist setting of the critical problem. And here I am in the fullest agreement with Gilson. And the other which consists in the refusal of any possibility whatsoever of posing as philosophically soluble the whole critical problem. It is here that I part company with Gilson. I believe that it is possible, in fact that it is the particular office of wisdom, to face this problem in a wholly other fashion than that of idealism. To my mind, it is inexact to say that realism only exists by idealism. On that ground, no true thesis would exist except by right of the error which it refutes, and a dogmatic definition would depend on the error which it opposes. And that realism, in order to be critical, must borrow from idealism the posing of the problem. Nor is it sufficient to point out that realism has succeeded at the point where idealism fails, or to demonstrate the insufficiency of the latter in constructing a viable philosophical system. Without doubt, that is an indirect sign whose value is far from negligible. But the point which it is necessary to bring the mind to take full cognizance of is the absolute impossibility in itself, and as such of idealism. More, there is not the slightest reason for abandoning into the hands of the idealists the whole use and possession of the word critical and all it signifies. To criticize in the exact sense of the word is to judge, in conformity with the exigencies of the object under examination. And how can judgment and the control of the self by the self be held alien to the one philosophy in which the mind is characterized by its capacity for a complete return upon itself? Truly, as I have already claimed in an earlier book, and as de Tonquédec has forcibly pointed out, the primary reproach with which we can face critical idealism is that it is and has been insufficiently critical. The critical problem is not, how is it possible to pass from being perceived, thought being itself the sole object attained with indubitable certainty, is it possible to demonstrate that it attains also to things, to a real which is its measure? It is this. What value, in the various degrees of the elaboration of knowing, must we recognize and perceive and learn? Thought giving itself at the first shot, and as if with complete assurance to things and being given its measure by and being independent of it, how is it possible so to judge? How, under what conditions and what measure is it really thus in the beginning and in the various degrees of human knowledge? It is absurd to demand from philosophical thought that it should begin, before rightly knowing anything, by giving proof that it is able to know which it can only know by knowing. It is absurd to suppose, first of all, that what cannot be judged as true by thought may, by the action of some malign genius, not be true, in order to demand, as a result, that this same thought should demonstrate that in fact it is not so, or to admit that thought can only attain to phenomenal objects, and then ask that it should prove that these objects are extramental realities. Such things are those ill-thought questions which St. Thomas, following St. Paul, counsels us to shun. But when thought has begun to operate, to know and to philosophize, to acquire the certitudes of science and of wisdom concerning things in the soul and their first cause, it has need to turn back upon itself, and on these acquisitions and apply itself to the knowing of knowledge, to judge concerning it, and to verify it, in order to advance again, and again to circle back upon itself. This is the task of metaphysical wisdom, which, as the highest natural point of spirituality among the sciences, has the power to go back over the principles of these latter and over its own, in order to justify, if not by direct demonstration, for it is an apodeousia, that is, ignorance to wish to demonstrate everything, at least by a reductio ad absurdum, and so fulfill that self-return which is proper to the spirit. In a sense, it is ungrateful and dangerous work. the danger is sufficiently obvious, as is all recension and verification, all the registration of reflex valuation, a work which goes against nature, but which is indispensable. For the intellect even more than the hand needs to know how to control its tools, and that instrument, which is itself. It makes a particular call on the sobriety and humility of veracious science, and on that respect for the object, which is in this case the mystery proper to knowledge. Thus humbly, by the impossibility of their contraries, the fundamental truths, and particularly the general validity of knowledge and its first principles are confirmed. Then follows the principal business, where research can advance and exhaust itself endlessly, which consists on the one side in the analysis and description, with full respect for its integrity, of the objective content of knowledge in its diverse phases, and of the witness which it gives to itself. On the other side, of the endeavor to penetrate metaphysically into its nature and its causes, and to make it in the rightful sense of the word know itself. After which it is possible to proceed to the detail of instances and discrimination of gnosiological values, and what in the act of knowing depends on the real, and what on the constructive activity of the mind. Thus the treatise on the divine names in the Summa is a critique of theological knowledge, and thus again, all search for the true significance of physical theory is an attempt at a critique of physico-mathematical knowledge, like, for instance, the discovery of the laws of that transcendental theme, which is at various times under discussion in the present book. The mind throughout has a veritable understanding of the object which it proposes to itself, and judges of it in accord with the intrinsic necessities proper to knowledge. Indeed, in the strictest sense of the word, it is a critique of knowledge which will have been instituted. But its work will always and essentially remain a taking cognizance of, a return on another activity, which is the knowledge of things, a purely reflective activity. When this condition is fully understood, the principal danger drops away. Such a critique of knowledge will have been subject to no idealist contagion, for it is in effect essential to all idealism to mix a constructive desire with all reflective activity. However unacknowledged it may be, however dissimulated under the aspect of a pure methodical austerity, at least the desire to make the whole nature of philosophy depend on this preparatory self-reflection, if not to make it wholly consist of it. As soon as one acknowledges that the work of a critique is purely and exclusively reflex, secondary, not only in order of time but of nature, and therefore cannot separate itself for an instant from the knowledge of the real, without having recourse to an illusory self-devouring, one is securely inoculated against Cartesian fever. Scio aliquid es, or to know a thing as something. If the foregoing remarks are correct, it follows that a Thomist criticism of knowledge will differ from the beginning, and by reason of the very method of its procedure, from that of any type of idealism, and particularly by these 3 points. 1. It is in no sense the pure cogito shut in on itself which makes its point of departure. Criticism, as a work of philosophy, implies the act of consciousness, whereby the mind goes philosophically back over its preliminary work of knowing. And this is not the act of consciousness, which is in point of fact and chronologically first. To what point in that case of infant experience would it be necessary to return? But that act of consciousness which is verified by the philosopher as being by right and logically firsts when he lays bare those most primary roots of knowledge which constitute his point of departure. How is this exactly determined? In my opinion, 3 primordial axioms, which each imply the others, are included in this fundamental act of consciousness and impose themselves on any philosophic analysis. The incontrovertible evidence of the principle of identity, that primary fact to which we are led, by the resolution of the knowledge which has already been acquired, and in which we find the very first, i.e. in the order of reason, living connection between the mind and things. The general truthfulness of our powers of knowledge, which is like the first if highly indeterminate witness which the intellect gives to itself. The notion of truth, whose elucidation presents the primary problem which criticism must solve. Thus, if we wish to formulate directly that experience, which forms the point of departure for all criticism, it must run not, I think, but I am conscious of knowing. I am conscious of knowing at least one thing, that which is. The cogito ergo sum is ambiguous. It is proffered at the same time as the point of departure for the whole of philosophy and for the critique. If we were in search of an equally ambiguous formula to serve both these aims, we could say, I know that something is or can be, but it would be necessary at once to resolve it into the two significations which it embraces and which would need to be differentiated. For the one is concerned with direct knowledge and the first movement of the mind, the other with reflex knowledge and the mind's secondary motion. When I say, I know that something is, or may be, I can have the intention of affirming simply that something is, or may be, an enunciation in this case concerned with the first movement of the mind, and thereby related to the starting point of all philosophy. The concrete experience which it translates includes, besides all the complexity of my cognitive activities, for my intelligence, there lays hold of intelligible being, on which it bears directly, and which has been perceived by it in exactly so far as the surrounding possibility of eternal exigencies forms the object of its whole first purely intellectual certitude, principle of identity, but which it grasps in fact in turning back on some singular object given to it by the senses and from which it has caused it to arise, and in going back also, although entirely implicitly, and by the single fact of judgment, on its own act of knowledge and its relation to the thing, on the self which knows and whose existence and act, for me the most indubitable of all such existence, is so made known to me, but as though in its germ, in the first act, and not yet effectively, each time that I know. If I say after this, I know that something is, or may be, having taken explicit cognizance only of what was included in direct knowledge and meaning to say that I know that something is or may be, ego I know that there is something. My statement is then concerned with the second motion of the mind, refers to the point of departure of a critique. The position so taken up is this: since the intellect deals first of all neither with itself nor with myself, but with being, the very first evidence, I say first, not in the order of time, where what in itself is primary is only implicit but in nature. The evidence which in itself is first for the intellect is that of the principle of identity, discovered in the intellectual apprehension of being or of the real. I have said that the real in question is not necessarily in the actual existential order, although it may be as incarnate in the example of some sensible existence that the intellect first lays hold on the principle of identity. In itself this principle bears on the whole extension of being, and primarily on the order of essences, on the possible reality. But at the same time, in the intelligible order itself, a certain actual reality is given to the intellect in this first act of perception and judgment, this time from the side of the subject, i.e., the existence of the thinking subject itself, for all that it is implicitly and preconsciously and by an initial act and not yet as an express object of knowledge. Thus the intellect here embraces in its own sphere at one and the same time the possible real, the object, all being, set before the mind and attained by it, and signified in the enunciation of the principle of identity, and the actual real, the reality of the thinking subject, not yet attained in ultimate act, in the second act. Intelligible being and the self are given it at once and together, but being is in the foreground and, as it were, on the center of the stage, and the self in the background or in the wings. It is only with the second movement of the mind, in that reflex act which serves as a starting point for the critique of knowledge, that it comes into the foreground. 2. An authentic criticism of knowledge does not in the least imply a single moment of real universal doubt. Such a moment in effect includes in exercise the negation of what it is assumed one as yet knows nothing of, I mean the essential ordination of the intellect to being, and creates a vicious circle. As I have indicated elsewhere, the universal knowledge of the truth of which St. Thomas, following Aristotle, speaks, that putting in question, or universal aporia, which is the privilege of metaphysics, that videtur quod non, that which seems not, which is the beginning of all scientific research and which stops at nothing, is not in any slightest degree a living or exercised doubt, no more than it is the phenomenological bracketing. It is not a living bracketing, but one put forward as a hypothesis to be examined, a conceived or represented doubt, and by this much more rigorous and much more sincere than the Cartesian doubt, for it involves no ruse, no arbitrary forcing from the side of the will, no pseudo-drama, and the end which the mind arrives at as a result of this universal problematization is precisely the clear and deliberate consciousness of both the absolute impossibility of realizing a universal doubt, or a putting in parentheses of all certitude concerning the being of things, and of the knowledge which it already possessed rooted in the exercise of its basic activity, although unformulated from the very start, of its essential ordering for the apprehension of things. For in every judgment the intellect tacitly and virtually knows itself, in whose nature is to be overwhelmed by things. The intellect lives realistically before it recognizes the name of realism. Finally, an authentic critique of knowledge, comprehending that it is absurd to go back on its traces at the first step, does not give itself out as the preliminary condition of all philosophy, the conception of philosophical radicalism, formed by Cartesians and neo-Cartesians, appears from this point of view as an almost perfect type of presumption in the field of human knowledge. The critique of knowledge presupposes a long-continued effort to know, knowledge which is not only spontaneous, but also scientific, not only scientific in the modern sense of the word, but philosophic and psychological, logical, and metaphysical. It is itself a part of metaphysical knowledge, the supreme wisdom of the natural order. And although in the interests of exterior order in a written treatise, where one must behave, alas, as if knowledge were achieved and fulfilled, it is convenient to place the critique at the beginning of metaphysics, like a sort of introductory apologetic. In reality, criticism, ontology, and natural theology all grow together, even more closely interconnected than the moral virtues, since they are integrated into one and the same specific whole. Instead of being a precondition of ontology, epistemology ought to grow in and with it, sustaining it and being sustained by it, being at once explanatory and explained, mutually supporting elements of one true philosophy. The critique of knowledge or epistemology has no existence as a discipline distinct from metaphysics. To give it a separate existence is to interpose a third term between realism and idealism, between yes and no, which is indeed the pretension of the moderns, with their unthinkable notion of a pure phenomenon, which voids the very concept of being of any being, that most general of all our concepts. It is in this way, by the very setting up of the problem, and from the outset, that a Thomist critique of knowledge is distinguished from all the pseudo-critiques of idealism. Will Gilson grant after this explanation that his objections to the possibility of a Thomist critique of knowledge are not insuperable, and that the idea of critical realism is not self-contradictory like that of a square circle? In any case, it must be obvious why I hold that Thomist realism is not only not naive, if by that is meant the absence of scrupulous scientific accuracy and the thirst for verification, for the word can also imply the naturalness of the procedure, a recognition of the primacy of nature over reflection, but that it is also conscious, considered, and deliberate or methodical. Still more, that it is truly and rightly critical. Indeed, the only gnoseological doctrine which rightly merits the name. These comments on the notion of critical realism are only a preliminary. It is necessary now to touch on some of the questions which are central to the critique itself in the endeavor to posit any just idea of speculative philosophy and of the two typically distinct degrees of knowledge which it implies, the philosophy of nature and metaphysics. It is in effect necessary to treat first of all of noetics, the understanding, and to establish a certain number of propositions concerned with the much more general problem of the relation between thought and reality. I shall begin then with a sketch of the solution which, I believe, can be brought to bear on these problems by the principles of the critical realism of Aristotle and St. Thomas. This exposition will perchance make it easier to confront Thomist thought and those diverse tendencies which have been grouped in England and America under the title of neo-realism, and which in Germany have been christened phenomenological philosophy. They are tendencies which seem to me to possess great interest, and which I hold possessed of a high degree of intellectual stimulation, but which seem perhaps a little too much under the compulsion of the need to react against dominant prejudices, and are thus too much and too gratuitously a priori, and thereby too indifferent to the real depths of metaphysics. I shall only offer on these themes indications and suggestions in passing, for my plan is not to propound a thorough examination of such tendencies, but rather to treat of the degrees of knowledge, the philosophy of nature and metaphysics, and so to fix first of all the gnoseological propositions which are requisite for that end. Realism and Commonsense. Nowadays, when the world suffers so much from the mind's self-division, when common sense has had to put up with so many insults, a realist philosophy usually begins by some attempt to rehabilitate common sense in one fashion or another, and to reopen connection with it. It is an excellent preoccupation, for it teaches philosophy a certain measure of humility, it brings it back into line with nature, and it tends to re-establish intellectual unity at the most fundamental and modestly human point. That point where the thought of the man in the street unites with that of the philosopher. But it is also dangerous, for common sense is nothing homogeneous, and because a large part of scientific progress, above all in its modern expression, runs exactly contrary to it. If one takes common sense in the purest sense of the word, meaning thereby that common awareness of truths known as such and the principles of reason, that metaphysic which is unformulated, but rich in the possession of certain absolutely fundamental certitudes for human life, which reason by the aid of experience draws from those principles. Then, for Thomists, it must be said there is indeed a solidarity between common sense and philosophy, though at the same time a clearly drawn distinction. For philosophy is a form of knowledge where the fundamental certitudes of common sense are rediscovered, but as they are formulated by critical reasoning and in a scientific state, and which endlessly extends these certitudes by means of new discoveries and new demonstrations, and which is based not only on common sense, but on the evident necessity of those principles which the intellect knows by intuition. St. Thomas's position is thus, while maintaining both forcibly and respectfully the coherence between common sense and philosophy, very different from that of Reid and much more critical. Simple-mindedness and the superstitious fear of being so are, we may observe in parenthesis, the two enemies of any sane critique. Philosophy, in so far as it is, wisdom needs to verify its organs and its instruments in the degree to which it advances, and can take nothing from either nature or culture without examination and judgment. But to pretend to justify oneself from the beginning, and to take nothing from nature, to make the course of the world consist in the fact of this self-verification, is to shut it up in a state of pure artificiality, which belongs to that worst form of simple-headedness, that of the professor. We might well ask of those philosophers who are at pains to put an end to all this simplicity, how they manage to get born. They will find it equally hard to get born into wisdom, and so into criticism. Let it be added that in any case, simple-headed simplicity is better than elaborated simplicity. It at least is in line with nature and curable. In fact, in the course of the history of thought, it is simple-mindedness which by reflecting on itself, little by little becomes critical, and such critical progress is destined to endure forever. A Socrates or a Plato, an Aristotle, or a St. Augustine by no means ignored the critical problem. The fourth book of the Metaphysics is pregnant with a critique without the name. There is a deeper criticism in Albertus Magnus, in St. Thomas or Cajetan than in Kant. Nevertheless, they never dreamed of making a special body of doctrine of the reflective and critical section of metaphysics, so leaving vast regions of knowledge lying as it were fallow. And one must add that in their time, as I pointed out above, there was a much less explicit and defined separation of the critical problems and their corresponding technique. It remains for the Thomists of today, of this reflective age, to carry this technique to a point worthy of the thought of their masters. The apparatus of observation which should be applied to primary notions and first principles will always require perfecting. We cannot have done with pre-critical naivete once and for all. Knowledge precedes reflection, as nature precedes knowledge. Critical reflection must increase with each increase of natural knowledge. I said that general common sense was not at all homogeneous. In fact, it is made up not only of those intellectual elements of which I spoke, but also of a mass of imagery, according to which, for instance, the sun moves round the earth. Height and depth are absolute determinations of space. The antipodes live upside down, etc. It is absolutely necessary to discriminate between common sense and this imagery, and it is only on condition of their deliverance from the latter that science and philosophy can advance. Finally, it is necessary to keep in mind one of those fundamental apothegms which St. Thomas is never tired of repeating, that the human mind belongs to the lowest stage of the scale of minds. By reason of this, the word natural has, when in relation to man, two entirely opposite meanings. Common sense, insofar as it is natural, i.e., in conformity with the essential inclinations of the mind, is naturally in the right, agile, and intuitive, and goes from being towards God by a sort of spiritual phototropism. And it is in this sense that philosophy is its continuation. On the other hand, when the word natural is taken in the second and wholly different sense and means exposed to all the ordinary perils menacing our intelligence, common sense has a certain natural propensity for stupidity, for materialism, for the incomprehension of what is living and spiritual, and in this sense philosophy is constantly obliged to correct it. Thus, it is easy to see why the history of thought, at least insofar as it is a progress, is made up of a series of scandals for common sense, each of which is followed by a higher reintegration and reconquest of victory for common sense. Each of our paces on this earth is in itself the beginnings of a fall and its recovery. The truth. One of these primary scandals for common sense is that concerned with the relation between things and thought and the very notion of the truth. What I think is what is, thinks common sense, and it is not in the wrong. But at once this affirmation is materialized, sinks into a facile representation, and we begin to imagine that thought is some sort of copy or tracing of the thing, in all ways coincident with it, so that all the conditions of the one are also those of the other. Reflection is not slow in evoking certain bitter disillusionments. If thought or knowledge is a copy, a tracing of things, if all the conditions of the one are also those of the other, how is it possible to err? It would be absurd to imagine error as the tracing of something which is not. And how? By means of a multiple thought such as the idea of living being joined to the idea of capable of sensation and that of capable of intelligence. Can we know a thing one and undivided in itself as is what we call man? How by universal ideas can we know what in its own existence is singular? By theorems of the rectangle, the geometric properties of this table? And how can we look at this bindweed or this apple without ourselves participating in the sensations of their vegetable existence? We are thus constrained to make a certain divorce between things and thought, to recognize that the conditions of the one cannot be those of the other. The way in which things live in our thought in order to be known is not the same as the way in which they live in themselves. The mind thus, as soon as it begins to reflect on itself, perceives that there is an inwardness of thought, a universe apart from, however open to, things. It is above all necessary to be on guard against the reduction of mental things to spatial imagination, but it is vain to try to overleap the limits of human language. The expressions in thought and outside thought have no more spatial significance than the word spirit, which originally meant breath, or the word God, which originally meant light. In the same way, when we speak of creatures which exist apart from God, the use of space is entirely metaphorical. Here it simply signifies that sometimes the thing exists, actually or possibly, for itself in the universe which we see, and more generally, in the order of simple position or existential effectuation, and sometimes not for itself, nor in this universe, nor in space, nor in the order of the simple position outside nothing, but under quite other conditions which are those of thought, and as a beginning or end of the act of thought. In this case, we say, it exists in thought. To draw any argument from the metaphorically material or spatial sense evoked by this in and the outside which corresponds to it is the banal sophism of idealism. But to interdict, under the pretext that the mind is neither a courtyard nor a cupboard, the use of such expressions as in the consciousness and outside consciousness would be to take exception at the outset to that inwardness which is proper to the mind and condemn oneself to describing knowledge with the mind left out. In other words, the interdiction of any penetration into what is knowledge. This comment having been here made once and for all, we can pursue our proper object without tripping over words and without fear of using language which, like all metaphysical terms, only refers to space metaphorically. Things have two different forms of being, two differing planes of existence. Their rightful existence by which they act and hold themselves apart from nothingness, and the existence which they take on in the apprehension of the soul, so as to be known. In order to enter into the sense of sight, the bindweed and the apple have to leave off that matter by which they subsist. In order to enter into the intelligence and the reason, they lay by their individuality. In the inward world of our intelligence there are a multitude of distinct aspects or concepts of things which in the world of nature exist in an undivided state, and which lead in one world a life wholly different from that of the other. In one the lion devours the antelope, in the other he achieves by means of the copula the predicate carnivorous, and the possibility of error simply arises from the disparity between these two worlds. All of which shows that thought is not a copy of the thing corresponding materially with its model. There is an abyss between the conditions and mode of thought and the condition and mode of things. But it also signifies that there is between the thing and the thought that is in act, an incomparably deeper unity than that between a model and its copy. For if things were modified or in some way changed, I do not say in their conditions, their manner of existence, but in their rightful constituents, in what they are, by sensation or intellection, there could be neither truth nor knowledge, and the theoretician of knowledge could not even begin to lift a finger in explanation, for in that case he would have only two equally impossible resources, either to say knowledge implies a relation with things, but one which deforms them, and so they can never be known, or that knowledge implies no relation with things, and that it is an expansion of absolute thought which has only itself for object, a position incompatible with the fact of error and that of negative ideas, and which moreover appears self-refuting, since one can only affirm that knowledge itself is this or that, in holding it distinct from the act by which one thinks. It has been very well demonstrated in England and in America that the principle according to which every relation must modify or alter its term is a pure postulate, for which no proof has ever been forthcoming, and is incumbent only on idealism, and all efforts to demonstrate it only lead to the declaration that a thing cannot be known without being known, a proposition of which the world was in no particular doubt. The relation of knowledge is precisely a relation which does not deform, which neither alters nor modifies its objective. The scholastics used to say that the relation of the knowing mind to the thing known is a real one. It brings something new into the soul. But that of the thing known to the knowing mind is a relation of reason, which in no way affects or modifies the thing known. The mind's power to transfer things into an immaterial and universal condition, its division of them into diverse aspects, the way it shifts and manipulates them, separating, uniting, comparing them with what is outside itself. All these operations are the conditions of their existence in it, and preparatory to knowledge. They do not constitute the act of knowing itself, and leave intact what the thing in itself is. In the working of this great logical factory, there is one secret, mysterious, and sacred substance which no treatment can alter: the essence or nature, the ontological inwardness of the thing made present to the mind by the idea. This distinction between the mode of existence of the thing and the thing in itself or its nature is capital in the theory of knowledge, and this exigence, which is inherent, immanent, in knowledge, to leave intact and unaltered the thing known, insofar as it is known, is so potent that it does not admit that in the act of knowing the thing and the thought should make two. For then there would be some difference between the thought and the thing. The thing, by the fact that it was thought, would not be purely what it is. In the act of knowledge, the thing, in the exact measure to which it is known, and the thought are not only united, they are strictly one. In Aristotle's words, the intelligence in act is also the intelligible in act. This is why I just said that the notion of knowledge as a copy or tracing is altogether deficient, not only by the disparity between the conditions of thought and those of things, but also because of the unity between the thing and the thought. Thus we see in what sense it is necessary to comprehend the definition of truth, which St. Thomas made classic: the adequacy of reality and understanding, adequation or conformity between the intelligence and the thing. This conformity has nothing to do with any copy or material tracing. Our knowledge comes originally from the senses. All our words, as we were reminded but a moment ago, are drawn from the sphere of the visible and the tangible. The words adequation and conformity are no exception, but their significance here must be taken with no trace of the visible or the tangible. It is a question of a certain correspondence altogether unique in its own kind, between the way in which thought declares itself on a thing and posits it in existence in its own inward act of judgment, and the way in which the thing exists. A correspondence which is an identity, not with regard to the mode of existence in the thing and in the mind, but to that of the thing taken in its pure value as an intelligible object, and which is in one case brought about, or can be brought about, outside the mind. In the other is lived in the mind by the mind as brought about or might be outside the mind. For judgment is like an imitation of the creative act by one incapable of creating. It brings the content of the mind into existence outside the mind, not by creation ad extra but by affirmation ad intra. Truth, says St. Thomas, is that conformity of the mind with being, whereby it calls being that which is and not being that which is not. This conformity is established by the being imprisoned in the thing and affirmed by the mind. When the act of the mind, by reason of which things outside it are referred to existence in a certain determined manner, accords with the way in which things present themselves in actual or possible existence, or in more exact terms, when the identification operated by the mind between the two terms of a proposition corresponds to an identity in the thing, then the mind is true. And whether it be so or not, we have no other means in each case of knowing than the resolution of our thought into the immediate assertion of sensible experience and the first principles of the intelligence, where our knowledge, being intuitively and immediately ruled by what is, cannot be false. But what is important for the moment in these remarks is to keep hold of the fact that truth is grasped in relation to the actual or possible existence contained by the thing. Truth follows from the being of things, and a new problem at once confronts us. Thing and object. If the preceding analysis is correct, we see that the same thing can be found at one and the same time in the world of nature, where it exists, and, when it is known, in the world of the soul or of thought, and it is necessary for us to distinguish the thing as thing, existing or able to exist by itself, and the thing as object, set before the faculty of knowledge and made present to it. The objects as such of our intelligence are abstracted from actual existence, and only hold in themselves a possible existence. On the contrary, the objects as such of our senses denote an existence in act, and grasp to exercise, held in the present if it is question of the objects of external sense, without the determinations of time, or in uncertain time, for those of the imagination, belonging to the past in the case of the objects of memory. The tragedy of the modern study of understanding began when the scholastics of the decadence, and Descartes following them, separated the object and the thing thus becoming doubly problematic in its concealment behind the object. What then is the value in this notion of a thing of which we have made use up to now in this analysis? This question is all the more important in that it is there that the most notable contemporary attempts, in England and Germany, to overcome the dangers of idealism have alike broken down. The moderns, generally speaking, take the object as pure object, detached in itself from anything where it could exist, i.e., from existence independent of my cogito, posited in itself before my act of thought and independent of it. Existence which one may call in this sense extramental, without this externality, having the least spatial implication, or which could also be called pre-mental, i.e., previous to the knowledge which we have of it, or again metalogical. Not in the sense that to know it is necessary to repudiate logic or to make use of another logic than logic, but in the sense by which it does not belong to the sphere of logic or of the rightful constituents of the life of the reason, to the sphere of the known as known, but is beyond that sphere. It is essential to add that in speaking of extramental existence, I am not only thinking of actual existence, but also and first of all of possible existence. For our intellect, in the simple act of apprehension, abstracts from existence in act, and in its judgments, does not only judge of what exists, but also of what might or might not exist, and of the rightful necessities inherent in essences. So that it is first of all, with regard to the possibly real, that it justifies itself, or better, confirms itself, or makes explicit to itself reflectively the value of intellectual knowledge, whence the critique of knowledge must primarily proceed. It is because of their misunderstanding of this fundamental point, because they confound the possibly real with rational being, and only recognize the actual as real, that the study of understanding of so many modern writers go astray from the outset. Then, the object being taken as pure object, separated from all that is extra-mental or metalogical, even if it is recognized that the objects of the senses and of the intellect, having as such their rightful and irreducible value, their constitution, consistency or intrinsic resistance, are not subjective modifications or products of thought, but typical structures given by intuition. The question presents itself of knowing how to explain the stable connections and internal regularities exhibited by these pure objects, and the idea that they are distributed in discontinuous groups because they are aspects, rightly it would be better to say inspects, or elements of cognoscibility of certain ontological nuclei called things, capable of extramental existence. The idea that the law of connection between the different images which our eyes perceive in looking at this table from various points of view is explained by the existence of a thing which is precisely this table, appears simply as one explanatory hypothesis among a crowd of others, equally possible. Some, indeed, hold with Russell and Whitehead that by the principle of economy, Occam's razor, it is better to pass by this hypothesis, which results, rightly speaking, in a form of Leibnizianism heroically pushed to the absolute in the passing over of all subjective or material causality, and the reduction of reality to a cloud of predicates, without subjects flying about in unbounded air, and which we endeavor to connect up with each other by purely formal laws. Others, like Husserl, endeavor to reabsorb the thing in itself and its existentiality into transcendental subjectivity, one of whose functions will be to set it up within itself, which is only another way of suppressing the thing in any authentic sense of the word, the thing which is extramental and metalogical. It must be said that this is fundamentally erroneous. Philosophical reflection has neither to reconstitute the thing apart from the object as a necessary hypothesis, nor to suppress the thing as a superfluous hypothesis, which is a contradiction in itself, but to affirm the fact that the thing is given with and by the object, and indeed that it is absurd to wish to separate them. On this point, a truly critical critique of knowledge, one which is entirely faithful to the immediate stuff of reflective intuition, is in accord with common sense in its apologia for the thing. In Thomist language, the thing is the material object of the senses and the intellect, while what I have here called the object, i.e., on one hand, coloring, sonority, cold, heat, etc., and on the other, the intelligible quid, intelligible essence, is its formal object, both the material and the formal object being attained at once and indivisibly by the same perception. If the word thing appears suspect as belonging already to common speech, nothing prevents our adoption of a vocabulary more in conformity with the habits of modern science, in other words, more artificial and more didactic, but which also shows a greater desire to guard against the uncritical preconceptions of common acceptance. I shall therefore say, bowing down in my turn before the jargon of pedantry, that as the object is correlative to a knowing subject, to an ontological for itself to which it corresponds, which by reflection on its acts of thought perceives immediately, not, as Descartes thought, its rightful essence, but the fact of its rightful existence, and which we may call the cis-objective subject. It is also not correlative to, but inseparable from, because it is itself, and ontological for itself, which precisely takes on the name of the object insofar as it is present to thought, and which we may call the objectivable or transobjective subject, not certainly inasmuch as it is hidden behind the object, but on the contrary, in the degree to which it is itself grasped as object, and that it nevertheless constitutes an irreducible in which the possibility of new objects to be grasped remains always open, for it can give rise to an indefinite sequence of necessary and contingent truths. The transobjective is not an unfigurable field of the unknown, which withdraws in the degree to which new objects are grasped, but that of known subjects indefinitely knowable as objects. Cis-objective or transobjective, the subject is never attained purely as such, but it is precisely this which is attained as object. The process of knowledge consists in making it into an object. That it is so, every act of intellectually conscious knowing tells us, so that if we admit that the mind really attains an object valid in itself, with which it can deal, we must also admit, and in the same degree, that it attains a possible or actual thing. A transobjective subject which is one with this object, or which is the ground or occasion of it, if the latter is a rational, not real being. Being in effect, the being contained in sensible things, is the first object attained by our intelligence, and what is meant by this name of being, if not what exists or can exist, and what is first and immediately presented by this to the intellect, except that it exists or can exist in itself or outside the mind? It is sufficient for each one of us to think for himself, to experience for ourself the absolute impossibility of the intellect's thinking of the principle of identity without positing, at least possible, extramental being, of which this first of all axioms expresses the bearing. A primary object which is extramental intelligible being, without which nothing is intelligible. There is the inescapable datum of fact, which imposes itself on the intellect in the very core of that reflection in which it takes cognizance of its movement towards its object. This apprehension of being is absolutely primary and is implied in all our other intellectual apprehensions. Hence, an object incapable of existing, a rational, not real being, can well be conceived, but on condition of its being referred to being, or to objects capable of existing, i.e., transobjective, possible subjects which the mind makes into objects, and at the instance of which this object is conceived, and without which it could not be built up by the intellect. If the notion of being can be extended to what neither exists nor can exist except in the mind, it is by an afterthought and on further consideration, by a secondary improper use of this primary notion, which makes it signify, conceived as it is in the way of being, exactly that which is not. Advancing further in this corrective analysis of the immediate content of knowledge, it can be said that, in the very order of sensitive knowledge, the content of a sensory perception is not only some sensible quality or some stimulation, but rather, insofar as what belongs to a non-intellectual plane of knowledge can be described in intellectual terms, Something impinges on us as an extensive field of determined sensory affective awareness, and so excites our motor functions. The behavior of animals can only be explained if, even at the lowest stages, the stimuli received are not only individualized in the subject in an act of sensation, but are still more individualized on the side of the object, in something at once sensory and stimulating perceived by the animal. Ascending the zoological scale, we see this something, which as known by sensation itself, is something purely indeterminate underlying sensory perception, become determined, solidified, and distinguishing itself more and more through the synergy of all the external and internal senses, and by the effect, it may be of hereditary instinctive estimations, it may be of individual experience. A dog does not only know visual, audible, etc., variables associated in a certain way, he knows his master, without the power of saying so to himself or of knowing why. He has on the sensitive plane, thanks to innumerable associations of similarity, something analogous to the knowledge, this time given by the intellect, which we have of this thing, that transobjective subject, which we call his master. And if the sheep flies from the wolf, it is not, as St. Thomas said, that the colored object thus perceived has wounded its retina, but that it sees in it its natural enemy. All of which presupposes that from the first, the external senses have communicated to the animal not only their proper sensibility, and at the same time the general sensibilities, such as extension, but also in a wholly implicit and potential state, indiscernible by the senses themselves, a thing which the proper object of the senses is an aspect. The ancients, assigning a reason for this fact, explained that the perceptive act of the external senses issues in the thing itself, or ends with the thing itself, terminating to the point, and that in the very degree to which the thing exists outside the knower, i.e., in the degree to which it exercises here and now an effective action on the sensory organs of the knower. And it is with regard to the thing so attained that they spoke of a judicium sensus, sense judgment, by which the senses at once adhere to the object perceived as an existing reality, and which is capable of deceiving us, when affected by the thing otherwise than as it is. Existence is not a sensible object per se, but though the senses are incapable of showing or discovering existence as such, what the intellect discovers, thanks precisely to the perception of the senses, and what it calls to itself existence, existence not only possible but in act, is nevertheless attained by it from the fact being rooted in its object. The analysis of consciousness attests this irrefutably. It is on what is given by the external senses, long before the reflex data of any possible cogito, that consciousness ineluctably relies when in search of the original type corresponding to the notion of actual existence, which is undiscoverable apart from the prime origin and significance of this notion. It is under the compulsion of the evidence of the intuitions of the senses that the mind is led to make its primary judgments on existence. As to the animal, if it lacks this notion, the relaxation of its motor functions by sensation, the thrill of desire or of aversion which makes it run to or fly the object so sensibly perceived, at least gives to it its practical equivalent, and alike attests the value of the existential certitude, not known as such, with which the action of the senses is impregnated. If the existence and act of a thing actually acting is thus implied by sensation, the at least possible existence of a possible thing, of a possible transobjective subject, is equally implied by intellectual knowledge. On the one hand, in effect, every predicate signifies not only such intelligible determination, but that which had such determination. The simplest intellectual apprehension, in perceiving what I call triangular, or conic, or musician, or philosopher, perceives some possible thing which is given to it as an object under the formal aspects in question. On the other hand, intellectual knowledge is above all achieved in judgment, and what is a judgment if not the act by which the mind declares the identity between a predicate and a subject in the thing or outside the mind, which differ in the notion or in their instrumental existence? For all veritable judgment identifies two terms notionally different. sunt idem recens subjecto, diversa ratione, the same subject matter but oriented differently. The notion of the whole is formally other than the notion greater than the part. The notion Mr. Bernard Shaw is formally other than that of dramatic author. And nevertheless, when I judge that Mr. Bernard Shaw is a dramatic author, or that the whole is greater than the part, I posit in actual existence a thing or object of thought, Bernard Shaw, and an object of thought, dramatic author, as identical, and that the possible existence of a thing or object of thought whole and the object of thought greater than a part are identical. I accomplish in the depth of my thought, with my noeniata, an operation which only makes sense because it relates to the way in which, at least in possibility, they exist outside my thought. The proper function of the judgment is thus to make the mind progress from the plane of simple essence, or of the simple object significant for thought, to that of the thing or subject containing, actually or possibly, existence, and of which the thought object's predicate and subject are the intelligible aspects. If we do not admit that the objects of thought are aspects, inspects, of actual or possible things that each of them contains, if I may put it so, an ontological or metalogical charge, the rightful function of the judgment becomes unintelligible. The analysis of intellectual knowledge thus gives us the same fundamental evidence in favor of the thing or transobjective subject as that of sensitive knowledge. In another sense than Lask's, one can say with him that every judgment supposes an unbroken harmony on the side of the thing, and, worked by the judgment itself, a reconciliation after conflict. The embrace preceding that condition of tearing apart, which it is the function of the judgment to conquer, is in the thing, in the given transobjective subject. The judgment restores to the transobjective subject the unity which the simple apprehension, as grasping in it its differing objects of thought, disunited. This unity cannot begin in the mind, since on the contrary the mind breaks it in order to fulfill it anew. It commences outside the mind, in actual or possible existence, which insofar as it is held in actuality is outside the order of simple representation or apprehension. Finally, in order that the judgment should so take place, it is necessary that every object posited before the mind should be posited as able to exist outside the mind, or if it is a question of an ens rationis, rational being, as if it could exist outside the mind. In other words, it is necessary that our intuition or intellectual perception, far from confronting us with a multiplicity of unresolvable, simple natures, should confront us with an object found everywhere and everywhere varying, which is being itself, and in which all our notions are resolved without prejudice to the irreducibility of essences. Under these conditions, judgment is possible, that is, as a logical movement which in the order of the purely rational, or in modern terms, a priori, progresses from the one to the other. It is not on the unity of transcendental apperception, but that, of a simple analogy or proportionality, of transcendental being, on which the possibility of the judgment is based. Whether it bears on rational or factual truths, on the ideal or the actual, real, it is thus irresistibly realist. And what is it then that thought wishes to observe if not the thing, the transobjective subject in all its ontological richness, in the infinity of its objectifiable reserves? A pure object, if such a notion were conceivable, would bring with it nothing but itself, and having once served and no more, thought could but turn the leaves of the objective world like a book of idle pictures. If the Schillerian idea of a perspectivism of the world of essences has a foundation, it is in the degree to which that world rises from a world of things or of subjects, in which, so that they may each be considered in their rightful essence, or in the relations which mutually support them. New objects of thought are inexhaustibly discoverable, as the directions of its attention succeed one another in the human mind. Indeed, the phenomenalist notion of a pure object, a notion from which neither the neo-realism of Russell and Whitehead nor German phenomenology has succeeded in breaking free, appears as rightly inconceivable. The unforgivable ambiguity from which it suffers arises from the fact that, in order to conceive it, it is necessary at one and the same time to posit the idea of being from the instant that one thinks of an object, and to reject it the moment one thinks of a pure object. The to and fro between the two terms of this contradiction deludes the mind with the sense of conceiving this entirely imaginary notion, a victim here of its natural propensity for being, that apprehension of being, which aids the deceiving idea of its capacity to think, that which rejects both this apprehension and all thought. More by a redoubled equivocation, being, as though it could itself make an abstraction of existence, comes to the point of giving its name to this pure object which makes an abstraction of it, and the philosopher at all cost directs his meditation towards the mirage of an ontology devoid of being. As soon as it is understood that this notion of the pure object demands that one should make an abstraction of being, or substitute the object for being, these illusions have no more power to hold us. Because the primary datum of thought is being, it is impossible to think of a pure object separated from ontological stuff, holding or capable of holding existence in itself, of a pure object separated from being in and for itself, of which the object of sensation or intellection is a determination or an aspect. If this object is not an aspect of a thing known, of a transobjective subject, then it must become an aspect of the thing which knows. Each of the great systems of idealism have endeavored at any price to escape from this alternative, and they have failed. Husserlian phenomenology likewise fails. It could be shown that when, by means of an ill-conducted abstraction which acts like a separation, it claims to escape any metalogical extramental subject, what it does shows up what it says, and it only makes use of his I-pole and the various progressively reconstituted stages of his objective world in thinking despite itself, while all the time rejecting any such thought, of the former as a transobjective subject and the latter as a cis-objective subject existing outside the apprehension of the mind. And when it claims to reconstitute the one or the other in the depth of the transcendental ego and the universal self-consciousness, it is only persuaded of its success by recourse to a conjuring trick, which consists in making use of transcendental being taken in all its native fullness to reduce it to one of its modalities, to being in thought. In other words, by drawing out of extra-mental being, which has been once and for all put in parentheses, the reality and existence in which the self and these others are muffled up, to which at the same time all real or existent being is refused, if not in and by the intentional life of the consciousness, yet in their dependence on the transcendental subjectivity and as inseparable from it. Let it be stated here once and for all, there is no way of transcending realism and idealism, no higher position which surpasses and reconciles them. There is only a choice between them, as between good and evil. Any realism which makes accommodation with Descartes and Kant will one day find that it is false to its name. A digression of phenomenology and the Cartesian meditations. It is curious to observe that the origin of the phenomenological movement lies in a form of activation of post-Kantian philosophy by contact with the Aristotelian and scholastic elements transmitted by Brentano. The notions of the Wesensschau, demonstrations of wisdom, and intentionality clearly show this influence. But from the beginning there is a complete deviation in the fact that reflex activity, though clearly recognized as such, has been utilized as if it were primary. It is taken as a basis for immediate a priori perception, as though reflection could, in returning on its direct operations and on their already apprehended object, fashion for itself from the latter an object attained before it, more immediately attained, and finally substitute itself for it, and betake itself to the discovery of those evidences which as primary in themselves surpass all other conceivable evidences. As though reflex observation, whose proper business is purely critical, could become constituting and constructive. There lies the first falsehood of phenomenology. This fundamental misunderstanding is bound up with the phenomenological bracketing insofar as it puts in parentheses the whole register of extramental existence and thus separates the object, the essential phenomena, from the thing. A phenomenological bracketing of which it must be said that, Like the Cartesian doubt, it would be legitimate signification, as envisaged eventuality, recognized as impossible, but which implies a contradiction in practice as really lived and experienced. In demanding from the outset, by an imposed postulate whose conditions have not been critically examined, that one should livingly put extramental being out of bounds, the possibility is practically and by presupposition admitted of stopping thought short at a pure object phenomenon, i.e., of thinking of being while refusing to think of it as being. It is not seen that the Cartesian assertion, according to which in order to build up a philosophy radically free of preconceptions, not based on reason, the mind must first of all cast out in practice every certitude concerned with extramental being, is itself a prejudgment born from a naively material conception of the life of the mind. For to allow no thing to enter into a material recipient which has not previously been verified, it is essential first of all to empty the receiver of all content. But since the power of auto-intellection and auto-criticism, of a complete return upon itself, is the privilege of the mind, the latter has no need to empty itself in reality of its certainties in order to critically verify them. Exactly that of which it is and remains really certain in actu exercito, in actual operation, it can ideally represent to itself in doubting of it, in order to realize whether such a doubt is possible. And it is only by such a suspension of judgment, signified, not lived, that it is possible to make critical proof of the primary truths. It is because the mind is capable of a perfect return upon itself that it can undertake a critical reflective description of its cogitata as cogitata, thoughts as thought, without any need to practice the phenomenological bracketing of Husserl. Still more, he has not seen that the first, absolutely unbreakable, apodictic certainty of the intellect is concerned with possible, metalogical, extramental being, of which it knows, in an entirely and eternally certain and necessary way, that insofar as it is not nothing. But his misunderstanding of the proper life of the intellect as such, and confusion of it with that of the senses, gives rise to the supposition that this first certitude should bear on the actually given, in the search for it in the pure cogito. And he sets ego cogito cogitatum, I think thoughts, as the point of departure for all philosophy. Keeping faith with the primary evidence of intuition, it should rather be ego cogito ens, I think being, the starting point, not for the whole of philosophy, but of that reflective part of first philosophy, which is the critique. The effect of this prime deviation is that the very notion of intentionality, in passing from the hands of the great scholastic realists to those of the contemporary neo-Cartesians, it is Husserl's own description of himself in his last book, has lost both its efficacy and its value. How indeed could it be otherwise, since its whole meaning comes first of all from its opposition to the esse entitativum, the concrete existence of the extramental thing? Intentionality is not only that property of my consciousness of being transparent in a given direction, of seeing objects in its own depth, it is above all that property of thought, the privilege of its immaterial nature, by which being in itself and outside the mind, i.e., entirely independent of its action, becomes existent in it, posited and integrated by thought for thought's own action, and by which henceforward both exist in it in one and the same supersubjective existence. If we do not go as far as this, if we refuse to the mind the power, which is only real if being itself is real, of surmounting and interiorizing being in itself, the pure transparence of intentionality is inevitably turned material, being regarded as a constituent of the object through its structural laws, by the asking of it to constitute the other and confer on it its own proper meaning, starting from my being as myself, whereas on the contrary it brings the other to me, starting from its otherness, and makes me be the other. And even as so often happens with Husserl, one seems so to speak to brush against the true nature of knowledge. Always in the end he passes on one side of the great secret. It is left dark that knowledge does not need to come out of itself to attain the thing which exists or can exist outside itself, the extramental thing which has caused the prejudice it is desired to exercise. It is in thought itself that the extramental is attained, in the concept that the real or metalogical is touched and handled, there that it is grasped. For the very glory of thought's immaterial nature is that it is not a thing in exterior space extended over another thing, but rather a life superior to all spatial order, which, without quitting itself, perfects itself with what is not itself, the intelligible real whose fecund substance it draws from the senses, gathered by them from the materially existent in act. The way to evaporate the rightful mystery of knowledge is precisely to exercise extramental being, to suppress these ontological, metalogical ice for themselves, entirely independent of my thought, which my thought makes its own by making itself into them. Despite the important services which it has rendered to contemporary thought, above all perhaps like Bergsonism heretofore by its extra-philosophical influence, notably in the stimulation which various scientific disciplines have received from it. Despite its original realist impulsion and its liberating virtue in regard to monism and mechanism, phenomenology runs the risk from the outset of ambiguity. Nothing is more instructive than the way in which, finally vanquished by the false radicalism of Cartesianism, it has ended up today, proud of its recovered chains, by indubitably returning to the Kantian tradition and by affirming a new transcendental idealism, which is certainly different from Kantian idealism, but mainly in the fact that it refuses to leave open the possibility of a world of things as such, under no matter what name of limited concept. While naive metaphysics operates with the absurd thing in itself, on the other hand, for phenomenology, being is a practical idea, the idea of an infinite labor of theoretical determination, and the world also is an infinite idea, relating to an infinity of concordant experiences. Despite the reserves necessitated by the difference of the two cases, one could say that Husserl's position in regard to Kant is comparable to that of Berkeley to Descartes. Berkeley also, in this battle against the thing, believed that he was avenging intuition. In suppressing extramental matter, he believed he had retrieved, he also, the meaning which the world, of objective realities, has for all of us, anterior to all philosophy. Husserl, in order to free transcendental idealism from the absurd thing in itself, reconstitutes by a more and more artificial procedure the whole universe of realism in the heart of the transcendental ego, starting from its rightful being. Though one may call this formidable task the discovery of the a priori constitution of the world of the real and of all possible being by the complete explication of the transcendental ego, it remains in reality a reconstitution, and, like all reconstitutions, presupposes an original, the world of naive realism, from which phenomenological idealisms suspended like a parasite trying to suck into itself its subject. It is by it that it lives, not only with regard to the various levels or stages of objectivity which it reconstitutes, after first of all having put them in parentheses, but also in regard to its notional instruments, the Denkmittel, thinking aids which it employs, and which are gathered by way of analogy from the conceptual register of the knowledge of things. Nevertheless, an unexplained residuum remains outside this universal science, the naive belief in extramental reality. Even if this belief is illusory, it is necessary all the same to assign the reason for such a universal and irrepressible illusion. But in that case, the method of phenomenology has been betrayed. And if this belief has no need of explication, because it finally finds itself reconstituted in the interior of the phenomenological bracketing, then it is not illusory, and the thing in itself is not absurd, but it is phenomenology to which an end has been put. The truth is that the belief in extramental reality is not reconstituted, but replaced by a substitute. A dispensation from the need to explain it is supposed to be supplied by the production of a counterfeit in the idealist style. Thus, contradiction is in the heart of the business. Extramental being which one began by putting in parentheses in forbidding either its denial or its affirmation finds itself, by the simple fact that in erecting a philosophy one accepts in actu exercito, in actual practice, the separation of the object and the thing, practically denied and finally cast out, without ever having been criticized and without even a question whether this separation was possible. A fundamental omission, which should cause transcendental neo-Cartesianism to be regarded as a system which is radically naive. Much more logical than Descartes, understanding, but in order to make himself more Cartesian than Descartes and to sacrifice the notion of extramental being, that the Cartesian problem of passing from the consciousness of my thought to certitudes concerning the being of things, thanks to the divine veracity, is a contrasense. E. Husserl has undertaken to construct his entire philosophy without coming out of the phenomenological bracketing. Nevertheless, it comes about that he leaves it despite himself. Since he reconstitutes so admirably in the interior of the bracketing all that he had left outside and put in parentheses, that in the end, everything that was in parentheses finds itself transferred to the interior of the transcendental ecology. Everything except extramental subsistence and existence, which have been turned out of the parentheses at the other end and cast out into nothingness. But then, there can be no more parentheses and no more bracketing. In maintaining the bracketing to the last limit, it has been suppressed. An admirable achievement certainly in transcendental sleight of hand, but equally undeniably a glaring contradiction in fact. The ambiguity of this last stage of phenomenology is such that it only needs a momentary misunderstanding, a lapse of mind, to think out in realist terms this renovated transcendental idealism. What in effect has been reconstituted in the heart of the intentional consciousness, before the cogito, is the whole universe of nature and culture, and it is certainly true that insofar as it is known, this is in the mind. When one involuntarily thinks that this same universe is also, and first, at least possibly, in existence outside the mind, one has passed surreptitiously into the world of realism. I am indeed not at all sure that it is not thanks to such unobserved slips of mind, the revenge of nature, that idealist philosophers are able to believe that they have thought out their systems. Finally, it seems that from the beginning, phenomenology has advanced by a form of unnatural hybridization between ontology and logic. It is a grave thing for a philosopher not to be able to distinguish between real being and rational being, and he runs the risk, despite all his protestations against castle building, of setting to work on the elucidation of a universe of fictions, and of leaving on one side the proper duty of an honest philosophy, which is to assign the reasons for the given data, and to win knowledge of them. Other inconveniences will also spring up. In excluding the transobjective subject, the rightful effects of materiality are introduced into the very world of intelligible essences and the a priori, and it is vain to try not to treat this world in empiricist fashion, as those who think with their eyes and their hands treat the concrete world of the sensible. For if the intellect in its proper life is pure, I do not say of those experimental deposits from which it draws all its substance, but from all material coaction and empiric servility, it is because all the contingent, the potential and the material, all that inert mass which can be defined by its resistance to intelligibility, makes part of the world which it is absorbed in and it knows, but is situated outside it as is that world itself. On the other hand, by the fact that the essences perceived by the mind are no longer seized in transobjective subjects existing outside the mind and themselves included in the flux of time, the extratemporal objects of the intellect find themselves, in an unexpected reappearance of Platonism, separated from real and temporal existence. And in order to reunite them, there is nothing to be done but to invert the intellect, giving time dominance over being. Whether like Bergson one seeks to substitute time for being, or whether with M. Heidegger to establish being over time. This is to assure the existence of realism by knocking away its foundation. Concerning idealism. It must be obvious from these considerations that the problem of the thing and the object is the central knot of the problem of realism. Philosophers imbued with Cartesianism call all authentic realism naive. However much one demonstrates that to apply such an appellation to Aristotelian-Thomist realism is puerile, they will not be undeceived. For to them this naivete consists in beginning with an act of knowledge of things, and not of knowledge. Let it be so. The mind must in fact choose its own way from the beginning, must make a primary decision, which will command all its destiny. But the first act of reflection shows that those who have chosen according to nature, and without rejecting the first ray of light which shines across our hearts, the first objective evidence, have chosen wisely, and those who choose against nature, who demand another light without pursuing the first, have chosen foolishly, wishing to commence with what comes second. One does not think of thought until after having thought of the thinkable good by existing, the real, or at least possible. The first act of thought is being independent of thought. The object of the first thought is not merely thought itself, but being. One does not eat the eaten, one eats bread. To separate the object from the thing, the objective logos from the metalogical being, is to violate the nature of the intellect, at once rejecting the primary evidence of direct intuition, and mutilating reflective intuition, that same reflective intuition on which everything is made to depend, in the first of its immediate presentations. Idealism sets an original sin against the light in the very heart of its whole philosophical construction. Since Leibniz, the whole endeavor of idealism has been directed to the suppression of all material or subjective causality in order to leave only formal causalities, and at the same time to annihilate the thing, every cis-objective or trans-objective subject, in order to leave only pure objects. Unless its full value is fully restored to the thing, it is a vain endeavor to call oneself a realist. Philosophy has become more and more purely reflective. It is only equivocally that it can now call itself either the philosophy of nature or metaphysics. For what is the proper object of natural philosophy if not the world of things subject to time and movement, which is also that of the experimental sciences at work on it from another angle? And to what is metaphysics directed except towards a world of truths above time, which are realized in temporal existence, and towards a supreme supertemporal reality preeminent above all things? While an exclusively reflective philosophy does not judge what is, but the idea of what is, and the idea of the idea, and the idea of the idea of the idea of what is, and all this with a tone of superiority because it has not stained its hands with the real, or run the risk of its scraping the skin off them. The courage proper to natural philosophy as to metaphysics is to face these extramental realities, to turn its hand to things and judge of what is. And their rightful humility is to take their measure from things, which is what idealism will not do at any price. It is scandalized by the idea that an intelligence may be measured by a thing, by an ontological for itself, which exists apart from it, in an existence less noble than that which knows it, and to which the intellect needs to unite itself by an effort of submission, which it has no power ever to exhaust. This scandal arises from the fact that intelligence exists not only in the created, but at a very low point on the ladder of spirits. An angelic intellect is not intelligence per se, how much less then the human intellect. But indeed, the privileges of intelligence suffer no detriment by this, for, far from opposing to the intellect, I know not what obstacle of matter absolutely without any connection with its nature. The being of things has a secret, and as it were sleeping aptitude for the embrace of the mind, and in taking its measure from them, our intellect in reality takes its measure from the intelligence in pure act, by which things are measured, and from which they draw their being and their intelligibility. And on the other hand, it is again intelligence, the intelligence which illumines the created participation in the intellectual light of God, which renders things intelligible in act, and which by means of the senses and of things determines the intellect which knows, and finally it is it which, under the same illumination derived from the primal truth, achieves actualizing its object within itself, and makes it so much its own. This is the office of the mental word and its letters of spirituality. and it only sees and hears below what it itself expresses, transparent with its own transparence. The mystery of creation alone can allay the scruples of idealism, and it is this ascesis proper to a created intelligence that idealism expressly rejects. But an obscure and powerful teleological motivation also intervenes, which idealism unconsciously obeys, so playing false at its own game. The point for it is precisely not to be led to a certain end, to avoid a certain final conclusion. If from the very beginning there is so careful an avoidance of things, and their extramental consistency regnant over our thought, it is in the need above all, by a secret instinct all the more imperious that it remains unavowed, not to come finally face to face with a supreme and transcendent reality, an abyss of personality to which all hearts are open, and before which all our thoughts must needs adoringly bow. The bastions and fortifications of idealism thus show themselves like huge works of defense against that personality who is divine. Nothing is more significant than these colossal works. It suffices for things to exist for God to become inevitable. Accord to a point of moss, to the smallest ant, the value of their ontological reality, and we cannot escape any longer from the terrifying hands which made us all. Under these circumstances, the humblest definitions of grammar take on a singular and powerful significance. The first person is he who speaks. This describes what I have called the cis-objective subject, embodied and subject in the world. He says I, not certainly in the sense of Husserl's pure I, stripped of all entitative subjectivity, concrete or embodied selfhood, but because a mysterious ontological and metalogical depth, a universe unto itself and core of liberty, knows itself in this I. Surrounding it there is an immense multitude of trans-objective subjects who are described by the second person, the one to whom one speaks and who speaks to us, each a mysterious core, rich also in a certain metalogical and ontological depth, and whom in this relation of me and thee wish to be treated with respect and with love. Thou spring, thou fish, thou swallow, it is charity which comes to supernaturally perfect our feeble philosophical apperception of the relations between beings, and St. Francis will speak of sister water and his brothers, the birds and the fishes. No attitude has a more profound metaphysical truth, and it is one which is essentially realist. Evidently for Brunswick there is no sense at all in a conversation with a bird. And all these things to which I speak familiarly, what is it that they say? The third person is he of whom one speaks. He is in all their mouths, all things speak of him. And while I know him not myself, I only hear the voices of all creatures speaking to one another of him. But when I do know him myself, with no other intermediaries than the light and the enunciations of faith, then then it is thou, yet more hidden and more mysterious and more free than all created things or than all men that might be created, it is thou that I hear. Things are opaque to us and we are opaque to ourselves. Pure spirits see themselves and see all things transparently. For them the object is the subject grasped in its entirety and its inwardness, not parceled out in aspects as it is for us. But for them, as for us, the distinction between the object and the subject persists. Their glance does not exhaust the obediential potency which is in them, nor the sum of all the predicates which will come to things in the progress of time. Subject and object are absolutely identical for God alone, like existence and intellection. Phi knows himself completely and all things in himself, for his act of knowledge is itself his infinite essence. Thus then the world of authentic realism is a world of things existing in themselves, a world, an immense family, a symposium of individuals and personalities in interaction, as the thing which knows is itself either an individual or a person, and this thing which knows is there in the midst of the others in order to draw them in a certain way into the heart of itself and to feed itself on exactly that which they rightly are. There are two ways, says St. Thomas, in which a thing can be found perfect. In the first, according to the perfection of its own being, in what is proper to it according to its own rightful species. but because the specific being of one thing is distinct from the specific being of another thing, the result is that in every created thing, the perfection which it possesses lacks absolute perfection in the degree to which equal perfections are possessed by all other species, in such a way that the perfection of anything considered in itself alone is imperfect, as being only part of the total perfection of the universe, which is born from the union of all these particular perfections gathered together in it. And therefore, in order that there may be a remedy for this imperfection, another mode of perfection is found in created things, according as the perfection which is the property of a thing is itself found in another thing. Such is the perfection of knowing in so far as it is such, for in the degree to which it knows the known in a certain way exists in it. And according to this mode of perfection, it is possible that the perfection of the entire universe may exist in a single and particular thing. Third, of knowledge itself. This passage from St. Thomas introduces us into the very mystery of knowledge itself. It is time to ask ourselves in what this mystery consists. What is the intimate nature of what we call knowing? It is, it must be admitted, a question which modern philosophers have not begun to treat, because they have never made up their minds to ask it. Neither Descartes, nor Kant, nor the neo-realists, not even the phenomenalists, except it seems Hartmann, who has at least profoundly felt the antinomies with which it is pregnant, have rightly faced it. It is the peculiar merit of St. Thomas and his great commentators to have frankly formulated this problem, which is the most important one of all noetics, the understanding, and which cannot be treated as it should be without the bringing into play of the most sensitized metaphysical equipment, and not only indeed to have formulated it, but to have provided the most profound solution. Before attacking it, they remind us of the need to raise our minds to a higher level, for we then enter into another order of things, et dices elevarque ingenitum, aliutenque rerum ordinarem ingredi. The errors which are so frequent in this region, proceeding from the fact that we too often confound a spiritual happening like knowledge with the material happenings which feed our common experience. I shall take the liberty brevitatis studio, in the interest of brevity, of proposing here a very succinct resume in 7 points of the Thomist doctrine of the nature of knowledge. The advantage of these forms of condensation is that they constrain the mind to the production of a synthesis occupied solely with essentials. 1. There is a rigorous correspondence between knowledge and immateriality. A being is knowledgeable in the measure of its immaterialism. 2. Why is this so? Because to know is, by an apparent scandal for the principle of identity, to be in a certain way another thing than what one is. It is to become another thing than oneself, fieri aliud esse, to be or become another in so far as it is another, esse fieri aliud in quantum aliud, which presupposes, on the one hand, the emergence of the subject capable of knowledge from matter, which restrains or imprisons things in the exclusiveness of their own being, and on the other, a form of union between the knower and the known, transcending any material one. For when matter receives a form, it is in order to create a third entity, tertium quid, which is informed matter. Thus, a material being can become other, i.e., can change or modify itself. It cannot become the other. While the knower, while all the time keeping its own nature intact, becomes the known itself and is identified with it, the knower being thus incomparably more one with the known than the matter with the form. Third, to know is to the senses and the intellect, taken as such as cognoscitive functions, as to exist is to the essence, to the quiditative function. It is a form of existence which defines knowledge. To know does not consist in doing something, nor in receiving something, but in a degree of existence greater than that of being removed from nothingness. It is an active, immaterial superexistence, by which a subject exists no longer only in existence limited to what it is as a thing included in a certain kind, as a subject existing in itself, but with an unlimited existence in which it is, or becomes so, by its own rightful activity and that of others. This is why in God, because he is infinite, Existence and knowledge are purely and absolutely one and the same. Between the esse divinum and the intelligere divinum, there is not the slightest, even virtual distinction. His existence is his very act of intellection. Having come to this point, we can comprehend that the formula, to become the other in as much as other, most certainly defines knowledge, but as taken first of all in what characterizes human knowledge, which is primarily directed towards another. An angel knows itself before it knows things. God knows himself. He is himself the sole specific object worthy of his intelligence, and it is in his essence that he knows all things, things possible and things created. In order to give a definition of knowledge capable of including the whole of this analogical span, it would be necessary to say that to know is to be or become a thing, oneself or another, otherwise than by the existence actuating a subject. An angel in knowing is itself and other things otherwise than by its own existence as a limited subject. God, by his wisdom, is himself, and things otherwise than by the existence which actuates a subject. The act of knowledge is not any of the actions which we customarily observe about us. It does not come under either the heading of action, nor that of passion, in Aristotle's table. Taken purely in itself, it does not consist in the production of anything, not even in the depth of the knowing subject. To know is to advance oneself to an act of existence of supereminent perfection, which in itself does not imply production. In fact, there is the production of an image in sensitive knowledge, of a mental word or concept in intellectual knowledge. But this interior production is not formally the act of knowledge itself. It is at once a condition and a means and an expression of that act. This is why the ancients called the act of knowledge an action properly immanent and perfectly vital, which belongs to the heading quality. 5. Wherever it is a question of a knowing being other than God, who is in himself supereminent over all things, we are constrained, if we wish to conceive of knowledge without absurdity, to introduce the notion of a kind of existence which is entirely particular, which the ancients called esse intentionale, intentional being, and which is opposed to the esse naturae, to the being which a thing possesses when it exists in its own nature. For indeed the scandals suffered by the principle of identity can only be apparent, and it is certain that if the characteristic of the knower is to be another thing than what it is, we must needs, to avoid absurdity, distinguish two ways of having existence. Conceive of an esse, or being, which is not the rightful existence of a subject as such, or of its accidents. How is it that the knower is the known? It cannot be according to its natural being that it can be what it is not. How is the known in the knower? It cannot be according to its natural being that a tree or a stone is in the mind. It is therefore necessary to admit another form of existence, according to which the known will be in the knower, and the knower will be the known, an entirely tendential and immaterial existence, whose office is not to posit a thing apart from nothingness in itself and as subject, but on the contrary, for another thing and in relation, which does not seal up a thing in its natural limits, but disengages it from them, by which the thing exists in the soul by another existence than its own, and the soul is or becomes the thing according to another existence than its own, intentional being, which is, according to Cajetan, there to remedy that imperfection essential to every created knowing subject of the possession of a limited nature and the lack by being itself of all the rest. In another order than that of knowledge, in that of efficient activity, is it not equally necessary to admit an intentional manner of existing? The way, for example, in which artistic talent passes into the hand and the brush of a painter? For the entire picture is the work of the brush. There is nothing in the picture not caused by the brush, and nevertheless its beauty and intelligible radiance, the spiritual values with which the picture is charged, surpass all the capabilities, in its connection with the material universe, of the causality proper to the brush itself, a causality higher than its own, and superimposed upon its own, must then have passed into it. If you scrutinize everything entitative, or existing secundum esse naturae in the brush, you will find no element of the painter's art, only the substance and the qualities of the brush and the movement to which it is directed by the hand. Nevertheless, the art has passed into it. Scrutinize everything intitative in the transmitting medium of the sensitive qualities. You will only find the properties and the wave and other movements that the physician recognizes. You will not bring the soul under the scalpel. Its quality has nevertheless entered in, sim du mes intentional, since the senses will perceive it when the waves of the vibrations reach the organ. It is a dream of the materialist imagination to think, like Democritus, that it enters in entitatively, or because it is not so to deny, like modern scientists, that it can enter in at all. The essay intentional, even when not concerned with the world of knowledge, is already for forms a means of escape from the slavery of matter. The scholastics frequently call esse spirituale, this existence not for itself, this tendence, existence by which forms which are not their own supervene in things. I hold that a great field of interest lies open for philosophers in the study of the part it plays even in the world of physics, which is doubtless the cause of that form of universal animation by which movement brings to bodies more than they are in themselves, and colors all nature with a semblance of life and feeling. However this may be, our concern here is with the part it plays in knowledge and the immaterial operations of the latter, the intentional presence of the object in the soul, and the intentional transformation of the soul into the object, the one and the other functions of the immateriality, imperfect for the senses, absolute for the intelligence of the cognitive faculties. 6. What is the means of union of the knower and the known? The medium thanks to which the known is intentionally in the knower, and by which the knower becomes intentionally the known. It is the whole world of intrapsychic immaterial forms which in the soul are like the deputies of the object, and which the ancients called similitudes or species. This word, species, has no equivalent in modern language, and I have decided that the aptest rendering of it is the expression, presentative or objectifying form. No more than that of the esse intentional, the notion of species is not for the philosopher an element of explication which is already known and fully elucidated by others. They are rather supports which result from the analysis of the data and of which it constrains the mind to recognize the reality, with certainty if the analysis has itself progressed correctly and under the constant pressure of intelligible necessities. It is absolutely necessary that some determination should supervene in the knower, thanks to which, what is not, it should be in it secundum esse, intentional and not like an accident in a substance, and which will be able to exist with the same active superexistence as that of the knower become the known. The species is nothing other than this internal determination. In the case of sensitive knowledge, the external sense itself in a state of vital tension, and which has only to open itself to know, all is ready in advance for it, and in this it is comparable to an already acquired intellectual habitude, receives the thing by its qualities acting on the organ, which so offers itself to be felt. We call it the sensible in act, a species impressa, a presentative form imprinted on it. Let us call it a received presentative form, thanks to which it is specified as by a germ which has entered into its depths, and having so become intentionally the sensible in the initial or prime act, the sense and the sensible then make only one principle of operation. In the terminal or second act it becomes it, in its own imminent action, and then makes only one act with the felt, not without producing at the same time an image of the latter, a species express of the sensible order in the imagination and the memory. The intelligence knows things informing them in the fruit, which it conceives in the bosom of its own immateriality. The Thomists, following Aristotle, recognize in it an active light, the agens or activating intellect, which making use of sensible representations and disengaging the intelligibility, which they contain in potential, which is not possible without leaving on one side the individualizing notes, enclosing the sensible as such, specifies the intelligence by means of a species impressa, of a presentative form, abstracted from the sensible and received by means of it. This is then the prime or initial act of the intellect. It has become, as indeed a principle of action, intentionally the object, which in its species is hidden in its depths like a fecundating seed, a co-principle of knowledge, according as the intellect, the sufficing principle of its own proper action, is already itself. And it is thus actuated by this species impressa, and producing thus in it, like a living fruit, a mental word or concept, a species expressa of an intelligible order, an elaborated presentative form, in which it brings the object to the sovereign degree of actuality and intelligible formation, that it becomes itself in ultimate act this object. If the distinction between the prime and the second act reappears again thus in the act of knowing, it is because this last, as I have already said, constitutes in itself alone a whole metaphysical order, where are reunited, transposed into the same line which is that of knowledge, at once the distinction of the essential form and the existence in the line of being, and that of the operative form and the operation in the line of action. Is not knowledge at once existence and immanent action? The soul, by its faculties of knowledge, becomes first, intentionally the object in the prime act, in order to become it as a result in the second, as nature exists before it acts. 7. In what is concerned with the species or presentative forms, it is necessary to distinguish carefully between two very different parts or functions. On the side of immaterial forms, these species are modifications of the soul, and by this right they determine the faculty in the same way as any other form determines any other subject. But these modifications of the proper nature of our soul, these intitative modifications, are not prerequisite to knowledge. They make no part of knowledge. On the other hand, presentative forms are, insofar as they are, means to knowledge, purely and formally deputies of the object, simply its similitudes, i.e., in the soul they are the object itself detached from its own existence, and made present in an intentional and immaterial state. In this way, they do not determine the faculty, as a form determines matter or a subject, but in relation to the entirely immaterial and supersubjective union by which the one becomes, first intentionally in the first act, then in the second act, and by its vital operation, the other in itself. And this entirely immaterial information, in which the soul only receives or experiences in order to exercise its own vital activity, to bring itself in act into an existence not limited to itself, is what constitutes knowledge. In thus making a resume of knowledge, it shows itself to us as an immanent and vital operation, which essentially consists not in making, but in being or becoming a thing, itself or others, otherwise than by the existence actuating a subject, which implies a much higher union than that of the form and matter composing a conjunction or tertium quid, and which also presupposes that the object known is intentionally made present in the faculty thanks to a species, a presentative form. Finally, that intellectual knowledge is accomplished thanks to a mental word or concept, a presentative form proffered from within itself by the intellect, and by which it intentionally becomes in the final act the thing taken as such, or according to its intelligible determinations. The concepts. Thomas distinguished between two forms of sign, which are essentially different, what is called the instrumental sign and the formal sign. An instrumental sign is something which, once known in itself, makes another thing consecutively known. A trail of smoke rising to the sky, a portrait painted on canvas which we see in a gallery, are objects on which our knowledge rests for a moment and passes on from them to other objects which are known thanks to them. To the fire of which the smoke is the effect and the sign, to the sitter of whom the portrait is the image and the sign. A formal sign is one whose whole essence is to signify. It is not an object which, having at first its full value as an object, nevertheless primarily signifies some other object. It is something which makes itself known before being itself known as an object. Or more precisely, something which before being itself known as an object by an act of reflection, is only known by the knowledge which is conveyed by its means to the mind of the object. In other words, which is known not in appearing, as an object, but by disappearing, as object, because its essence is to relate the mind to something other than itself. Everything which has been established up till now enables us to comprehend that the species impressa, or enlarged presentative forms which intervene in knowledge, are formal, not instrumental signs. Remembrance, or the presentative form held in the memory and which the memory uses here and now, is not what is known when we remember. It is the means by which we know. And what we know by this means is the past itself, the thing or event held in the substance of our past. The concept or mental word is not what is known when our intellect is at work. It is the means by which intellection takes place. And what we know by this means is the nature or intelligible determination in itself of some actual, or possibly existing thing. These, elaborated presentative forms, are the sole realities which correspond to the notion of formal signs, a notion cut to their measure, according to the exigencies of an analysis which respects the rightful nature of knowledge and belong only to it. All the other signs of which we have experience are instrumental ones. This is why, the moment one neglects or forgets the irreducible originality of the things of knowledge, presentative forms are so easily confounded with instrumental ones, just as the immanent activity of sensation and intellection is confused with the transitive activity proper to bodies, and at once knowledge perishes. St. Thomas, refuting beforehand certain idealist positions, took great care to point out that the species or presentative forms are not the objects of our knowledge, but pure means thereto. They only become the objects of knowledge reflectively, and thanks to the production of a new concept. If, he explains, our knowledge stops at them, in other words, if it is our own representations that we know, then, on the one hand, all sciences would be absorbed by one unique one, psychology. On the other hand, contradictions would be true, since a true judgment would be a judgment in conformity with our representations. He who decided that 2 plus 2 equal 4, and he who decided that 2 plus 2 do not equal 4, would be equally right in each declaring according to their respective representations. Thus, presentative forms, concepts in particular, are pure means of knowing. The scholastics call them objectum quo, mental objects by which knowledge takes place. What is known thanks to these immaterial species, they called objectum quod, the object which is known. If we should group the various elements which coalesce in an act of intellectual knowledge in a synoptic table, we should obtain the following scheme, whose scholarly aspect needs excuse, but which is of assistance in clarifying certain important distinctions, which in my opinion are capital. The object is grasped by the mind. This object which is grasped by the mind in and by the concept is the thing in itself, taken according to one or other of its determinations, and which, first by sensation and then by abstraction, has been brought, though stripped of its proper existence, within the mind. For the 3 first terms of this diagram are all inside thought. It is in the depth of thought that the object is attained, in the heart of the intelligence that it is known, which is why the ancients often called it objectivus conceptus. It is only the thing in its own proper existence, possible or actual, which is extra-mental and metalogical. But what is capital is that while existing under 2 different conditions, in the concept in a state of universality and of abstraction, which enables it to be manipulated, divided, compared by the mind, and also enter into the connections of discourse, and in the thing in one of individuality and concretion, nevertheless the object and the thing are not 2 known terms, 2 quads, but one. It is one and the same quad which exists for itself in the thing, and which is attained by the mind as object. Let the thing, for example, be Peter. He exists outside the mind under certain conditions. He is not only man, but animal, substance, etc., philosopher or musician, ill or well. Let the object, for example, be Peter as the object of thought man, which has in Peter and outside the mind a natural existence, and in the concept and in the mind an intentional existence, and which in the degree to which it is known or posited before the mind has only an ideal or rational existence. It is essential to concept to be abstract and universal. It is essential to the extramental thing to be singular and concrete. The object, on the other hand, which in the thing exists with natural existence, is singular and concrete, as is proper to the thing, and which exists in the concept with intentional existence, which is abstract and universal, is indifferently one or the other. It is posited in the mind in a state of abstraction and universality, which comes to it from its existence in the concept, where it is attained by the mind, but this state is not essential to it, since in the judgment, in the declaration, Peter is a man. For example, I identify Peter in the object of thought, man. As to the concept or mental word which I have in mind when I think man, it is held to be the sign of the thing, the similitude or deputy of the object, an inward end in which the object is intellectually perceived, terminus in quo. But let us be on our guard against that materialization or spatialization which language always brings in its train if we are not careful. The object is by no means in the concept as a material content in a material container. It is no material thing enclosed in another. It is an immaterial word omitted by the mind in explaining the object. To contain for it is simply and purely to know. The object exists in the concept and is attained in the concept in the sense that in proffering the concept, in the fulfillment of this intellectual production, the immanent act of intellection attains by this and immediately the object, and attains it clad in the conditions of the concept. And this is only possible because the concept is only a sign, a deputy or similitude of the object by right of the formal sign, as was pointed out above. What does this mean, if not that the notions of deputy or similitude or image must be purified here of all those features which would belong to things coming before the eyes of the mind, like a portrait before our bodily eyes? But then, if the concept is not a thing resembling the object, what remains of it? It remains being, as existent intentionally in the soul, and so carrying the object to the ultimate degree of spirituality, as making known what the thing or object is by right of the term known. The concept and the thing make two from the point of view of entity, but as formal sign and in the line no longer of being but of knowledge, it must be said that it and the object do not make two. The fruit of intellection in act, its content, is the intelligible object itself, but this intelligible content, which as object is set before the mind, as concept is vitally proffered by the mind, and has for its existence the act of intellection itself. As to its intelligible constitution, therefore the concept is identical with the object. Indeed, I do not say inasmuch as it will be what is known, but exactly inasmuch as it is the sign and inward end, by which the intellect becomes, in ultimate act, what it knows. It has just been pointed out that the formal sign is not something known at first, which consequently leads to the knowledge of another. Now it is understood that it is something known in the very degree to which it makes known, and by the act of making known. The immanent reason of the presentation of the object to the intellect in act. The concept or mental word is steeped in intellectuality in act. To be thought in act, to terminate intellection in act, is its intrinsic denomination, since it is in it that the object like the intellect achieves the ultimate act of intellectuality. But it is not as object that it is thought and known. It is not as a signified end that it is intellectum in actu, grasped and compenetrated by intellection in act. It is as signifying end. Finally, the concept in its entitative function, and as modification of the subject, and the concept in its intentional function, and as formal sign, are not two distinct things, just as intentionality is not precisely a thing in itself, but rather a mode. These are two formal aspects of two formally distinct values of the same thing, the intentional function only applying to knowledge, the entitative function to the being of nature, on this occasion the soul itself. As the divine essence has itself, in being intellection in pure act, the value of both species impressa and species expressa for the intelligence of the blessed, as the substance of an angel is itself the species impressa for its intelligence, the entity of the concept is in itself for us the formal sign of the object. As thing or entity, the concept is an accident, a quality of modification of the soul. but as arising in the soul as a fruit and expression of the intelligence already formed by the species impressa, already perfect, and under the action of this created participation in the intellectual power of God, of that center of immateriality perpetually in act, the highest point of spiritual tension naturally present in us, what should be called the active intellect, whence the intellect which knows derives all its formative energy. This quality, this modification of the soul which is the concept has, like all the objectifying forms, the privilege of transcending the function of entitative information exercised by it, and of being present in the faculty like a spirit. It is from the intelligence itself, from the intelligence in living act, that it holds this privilege, as though the intelligence gathered all its own spirituality into this one active point, there to bring it to a maximum. Thus, the concept is in the intelligence not only entatively, or as a formative form, but also as a spiritual form, not absorbed in the actuation of a subject, in order to constitute with it a tertium quid, a third substance, but on the contrary as actuating or rather terminating the intellect per modo intentionale, and in the line of knowledge, in the very degree to which it expresses and volatilizes the object. On the other hand, this form which the intelligence primarily put in act by the species impressa engenders in itself, through the discontinuous light of the active intellect, is truly, as I have said, the pure similitude or spiritual ignition of the object, or rather the object itself made mind, and intentionally present, not as object, but as sign. Because its entire specification comes from the object, the intelligence which illumines and that which knows being for it equally indeterminate. Thus, the concept, in its intentional function, and the object are indiscernible. Save as the one makes known and the other is known, the one is a sign and the other the signified, and that the one exists only in the mind, and the other in the mind and in the thing. By this we comprehend that the intuition proper to the intelligence lives, at the lowest stage, in abstract perception, working by means of the concept, and that for the things which fall in the first place within the grasp of our intelligence, this perception may be absolutely infallible, giving us those first principles, known by themselves, which direct the whole development of apprehension. And yet, because our intelligence must so form its objects for and by itself, and in the degree to which it advances in knowledge, actively draw from the same received presentative form, species impressa, those varied concepts which disconnect the aspects of one intelligible nucleus, according to the diverse directions of attention prevailing in the mind. For things are not only brought in the species impressa to intelligibility in act, they are also in the heart of the intelligence, inventoried and debated in multifarious ways in order to be brought in the concept to the final degree of intellection in act. It is equally comprehensible that the work of concepts may be complicated and tortuous, progressing from the indeterminate and generic to the determined, admits a large measure of artificial construction, causing us often to take wholly indirect views of things, or confused, partial, derived, or negative ones, and in short runs the risk of error in the degree to which it advances, and that not only in facts of judgment or reasoning, but also in the very facts of abstract perception. For when our intelligence is already occupied by these forms, the new concepts which it engenders, and whose formation does not only depend on the thing, but also on the already possessed objects by means of which the new object is set before the mind, may well be formed awry. Doubtless, when these are not pseudo-concepts presenting to the mind a complex of contradictory elements, for example, the greatest whole number or the most perfect world, they always present to the mind some aspect of the real, or some rational being founded on the real, but one which can be so arbitrarily reconstructed and cut about that the product is meager if not illusory. Thus we see certain concepts, made use of by science truly for long enough, and which are certainly not absurd, vanish forever, leaving no trace. The ancient concepts of chemistry with its phlogistic, for example, we can find in the sociology which stems from Kant, and in modern psychology concepts equally perishable. Certain idealist positions and attempted reactions. If now we return to our diagram, it is easy to pick out the classically significant moments for modern idealism. The latter is characterized, truly we must admit, by a radical misunderstanding of the very nature of the idea itself and of the intentional function of knowledge, which is henceforth conceived in the terms of an event in the material order. Descartes clearly perceived that the known object is known within thought. His capital error was the separation of the object and the thing, in the belief that the object is inside thought not as an intelligible made present in the mind by an immaterial form, with which the mind identifies itself intentionally, but like an imprint stamped on wax. Thereby the intentional function disappears, the known object becomes something belonging to thought, an imprint or portrait which is innate, and intellection stops at the idea, regarded as an instrumental sign. This portrait idea thing, has for double a thing which it resembles, but which is not itself attained to by the act of intellection. Here, therefore, are two separated quads, and there is need of the divine veracity to assure us that behind the quad idea to which we attain there rightly is a quad thing which corresponds to it. Thought cannot achieve it by itself. Thus the idea becomes, as Locke said, the immediate object of thought. Berkeley perceived not without reason that under these conditions there is no legitimate reason for preserving this thing which is the double of the idea, and he believed he was returning to the evidence of common sense when he affirmed that we have an immediate perception of objects, but that these objects are our ideas. Finally, Kant, admitting anew, like Descartes, a thing, das Ding an sich, hidden behind the object, but regarding it as constructed by the activity of the mind according to its a priori laws, arrested our knowledge at that of so constructed phenomena, the thing in itself remaining unknowable. All these philosophers equally neglect the rightful nature of knowledge. They envisage the work of knowledge on the plan of material activities, holding that an activity ad extra which is essentially immanent. For Cartesian innateness, thought is essentially passive. It is matter which has received an imprint. It is equally so for the empiricists, who regard this imprint as stamped on thought not by God, but by things. Kant wished to restore the activity of thought, but always in accord with the same type of a transitive or productive activity, imposing a form on matter. In this case, the form belongs to the side of the mind. Concepts are empty forms, and it is sensible matter which will be subsumed and organized by these forms. The inexhaustibility of the thing as subject having been thus transferred, by virtue of the Copernican principle, from thought as generative to the subject, the former appears as an indefinite process for the manufacture of objects. Indeed, the intentional function having disappeared, knowledge becomes perfectly unintelligible. For in the entitative order, it is clear that a thing cannot be another than what it is. Our idealists think it absurd, as they say, to look for something outside thought. Everything is absorbed into it, and henceforward, knowledge is its self-development in the same way as an animal or a plant, a lichen or a polypus, vegetates and grows. As to the present-day reactions against idealism, reactions which certainly in my eyes appear seriously incomplete, they are seen under two principal aspects. On the one hand, the neo-realist school, Perry, Spalding, Marvin, Montague, etc., by insisting on the immanence of the thing in knowledge, seem to misconceive the whole distinction between thing and object, and to enclose the extra-mental thing itself in thought, which has all the air of a contradiction. On the other hand, a more important group, to which it is possible, despite their differences, to attach at once thinkers like Russell and Whitehead, and those who have chosen the name of critical realists, Strong, Sellers, Santayana, etc., as well as the German phenomenologists, stop knowledge at an object which is no longer a product of the mind, as it is for the idealists, but rather in essence an irreducible datum, an intelligible independent of the mind, or at least proffered to it by an intuition. But this object essence remains for them, as for Kant and the whole modern tradition, separated from the trans-objective subject or extra-mental thing. The latter is only hypothetical and enigmatic, and indeed, by the principle of economy and Occam's razor, it would be better to pass it by. Or indeed, it is held absurd, and remaining without observing it in a certain dependence on Hegel, against that panlogism against which at bottom they are reacting, but from which they have learnt to confound logic and ontology, they endeavor, like Hegel, to reabsorb the thing into the idea, and characteristics are attributed to the object, taken in entire separation from any transobjective subject, which only in reality come from thence. No longer that reality in itself which Hegel accorded to the idea, but unproducibility by the mind, and irreducible consistency of essence. This process makes of the object, which is neither an aspect of a thing nor a modification of the mind, something entirely irrational, and knowledge itself an entirely unintelligible process, neither vitally immanent nor productive. Which, moreover, if it is neither productive nor transformative as Kant wished it to be, thereby remains rightly without an end. Not in the very true sense that knowledge continues to penetrate endlessly into things and adding truth to truth, but in the sense that, only laying hold on a thing by rules, it can only, despite the ephemeral constructions reared by the theoreticians of this idealism, redivivus, endless overreach itself by substituting one truth for another, without ever being possessed of anyone. The universe of existence and that of intelligibility. Everything which has been said of the concept implies the Aristotelian theory of abstraction, according to which the intelligence actively draws from sensible data, from things as they are first of all attained by the senses, a content in which intelligibility is potentially found, an operation which is only possible by leaving out all those individualizing characteristics which are found in the thing as such. It is this intelligibility that the intellect actualizes and proffers in the concept, and is the object known by it. If one thus distinguishes, as Aristotle and St. Thomas did, the thing and the object, but without separating them, and while maintaining their unity, what comes from the thing and what comes from the mind are considered apart in knowledge, then it is comprehensible how, from the things which exist outside the mind, which make up what we may call the universe of existence. The mind draws a world of abstract conceptual objects and universals, which may be called the universe of intelligibility or of human knowledge, which on the one side, in order that it may be known, is detached from the universe of existence, and on the other hand is identified with it for its subsistence. Thus, it is most certainly the things of the world or existence which we attain to in attaining to the world of intelligibility, but neither in their singularity, nor in the contingence of the flux of their singular eventualities. Our senses so attain to them. Science only attains to them directly, in the natures and universal determinations which give the grounds for their intelligible necessities. And it is in returning, as Cajetan says in a passage quoted above, by the ministration of the senses, to singular and contingent things that the universal is realized, in the reintegration of the intelligible in the existent, whether in the sensibly existent or in the spiritually so, that it achieves its grasp of the real. The one, the sensibly existent, is the origin of all our knowledge. The other, the mentally existent, may be reflectively experienced when the mind knows itself by its acts, or may be attained to by reasoning when it knows God and the spiritual world, by analogy with sensible existence, with which our mind must still be in relation in some degree, even in the knowledge of the supersensible. It must not be forgotten that if, in effect, the singular as such is not the object of science, and is not directly seizable by the human intelligence, it is nevertheless indirectly seizable, in reflex concepts. And it is in it as transobjective subject that science ends, completing the circle of its intelligible motion. This is why we have need of the senses, not only to draw from thence our ideas of things, but for the resolution of the judgment, which in one way or another, and even when the judgment is not verified by the sensible, must needs take place in the senses. Sicut extremo et ultimo, ad quod resolutio fiat, as to the ultimate and final point to which the resolution is directed, because judgment is concerned with actual or possible existence, and sensible and visible things are for us the paradigm of the existent. For St. Thomas, a science of nature which did not return to the singular real would be not science, but a dream. And it is the same, analogically, for metaphysics, which also returns to the singular, and for mathematics, insofar at least as it comes back to an intuitively constructible singular, where its fundamental entities have an imaginable existence. In effect, the end in which the knowledge of nature is achieved is the thing attained by the senses, above all by that of sight. As the cutler does not seek for further knowledge of the knife than is required by the work he has in hand, that is, to make this particular knife, in the same way the wise man only seeks to know the nature of a stone or of a horse in order to find the reason of the things which the senses are aware of. And as the judgment of the artisan of the knife would be deficient if he ignored the work in hand, the judgment of the scholar would be equally so if he ignored the evidence of the senses. On the other hand, all that is known by our intelligence, even mathematical beings and metaphysical realities, in the present state of the soul's union with the body, is known in some relation to the sensible things of nature. Thus, it is impossible that the judgment of our intellect should not be deficient when the exterior senses are closed up by sleep. It is indeed not true to say that there is only one world of intelligibility drawn by abstraction by us from the world of existence. There are as many universes of intelligibility as there are degrees of materialization or otherwise in the object. Rational being. The mind does not only abstract from the sensible those intelligible natures which are realized in the world of existence, it does not only set before itself those natures or the notions which are born from such, in consideration of the world of existence, all of which are able to exist. In brief, it does not only conceive of real beings, i.e., beings capable of existence, it can also construct in the image of such natures, ad instar entis objects of thought incapable of existing outside the mind, e.g. gender and species, the subject, the predicate, etc., which the ancients called rational beings, entia rationis. These objects of thought, which do not merit the name of essences, for essence is the capacity to exist, are not wholly created by the mind. They are made up of elements which are essences or intelligible aspects first of all grasped in things. For example, the object of thought, nothingness, is made up of being, to which is joined the notion of negation. In themselves, these are only non-essences, negations or privations. A chimera is a non-being conceived in the likeness of an animal. Or relations, which although they indubitably cannot exist outside the mind, have nevertheless the same intelligible content and definition to what as real relations. Such objects are not things. Nevertheless, they are not pure objects separated from any transobjective subject like the phenomena of the moderns, for they are conceived in the image of such subjects, a preliminary knowledge of which they presuppose, and they are constructed from elements drawn from the real. Far from being separated from these, they are thus doubly bound up with them. The actual or possible real remains their foundation and their occasion. From thence they draw all their objective consistency. If we can make judgments about them, it is because we treat them as they were things. Reason deals with these non-beings as if they were beings, when it affirms or denies something about them. And if the mind can be true or false with regard to them, it is by an indirect connection with the reality which makes their foundation and occasion. If you suppress the nature of a circle or that of a square, you cannot say that a square circle is unthinkable if you suppress the whole of apprehensible nature in its various degrees of determination. You cannot say that the species is a portion of a genus. If, as the critical realism of Aristotle and St. Thomas teaches, extramental intelligible being is the first object of the intellect, and if the existing real is first of all given us through the senses, we can be certain that our first intellectual apprehensions do not bear upon rational beings. Abiactu ad posse vale conscutio. Since there are ants, the ant is possible. And as to the possibility of being in general, it is certified for us, independently even by right, of all actual perception of existence, by the very first intuitive judgment of our minds, which precisely affirms that being is not being. But how can a philosophy which only starts from thought and according to which the mind attains at first only to itself, be sure that all the objects of our thought are not rational beings. This is where the malign genius plants his barb. The problem which was crucial for Descartes and for Leibniz. By that violent retorsion, that living contradiction which is in the heart of idealism, how is it possible finally to avoid the question whether being itself, in the image of which rational being is made by thought, and which in the first instance is conceived by the intellect as a possible reality, whether being itself is not a rational being? God does not make rational beings. It is a mark of the weakness of our abstract intelligence that in so many cases it has no power to conform itself to reality except by constructing these rational beings. We can only grasp the wounds of being and conceiving of them in the image of being. A rational being is created when the intellect strives to grasp what does not exist, and so it imagines it as if it were real. Let it be noted here that if there are rational beings like the square circle, the greatest possible whole number, the chimera, the best of all possible worlds, which cannot exist because they are intrinsically contradictory, they are the thieves and forgers among rational beings. There are, on the other hand, numerous others, honest rational beings, which cannot exist, not because they are composed of impossible characteristics, but because their place in existence is incompatible with one of their objective features. The notion of the predicate is not absurd, but it would be absurd to attribute an existence outside the mind to a predicate, which is defined by a certain function which a thing possesses insofar as it is known. Implicit in the notion of them as some relation to something real attained by the mind is, we say, that these rational beings are founded on reality. It thus happens that a rational being which cannot exist outside the mind as it is itself presented to the mind, i.e., as a being, can very clearly show, by reason of its foundation on the real, what exists outside the mind, and it is indeed only constructed for that end. To say that Neptune is observed by an astronomer is to posit a rational relation in Neptune, but it is certainly real to say that the astronomer observes Neptune. Evil is a rational being in the sense that to think of the bankruptcy of good, which there must be in a subject, I am forced to conceive of it, as if it were a thing. But evil exists most really and positively in the sense that the subject in question is thereby mutilated or deprived of something which should be vitally in him. The physician does not find deafness in the ear, and he does not look for it in order to destroy it as he would a colony of bacteria. Nevertheless, it is a very real thing to be deprived of the sense of hearing. The rational being Deiphius is founded on a very real derangement in the internal organism of the ear. Moreover, it is in very differing degrees that such and such an object of thought can be affected by the note of unreality characteristic of rational being, evil and deafness, while all the while referring to the very real fact that a subject lacks a good which should be there, are, insofar as they are objects set before the mind, like a substance or a quality, not beings. A geometric surface is a possible being, if it is a Euclidean surface, affected by a rational condition which prevents it existing in nature with that absolute absence of density which its definition implies. Movement is par excellence the reality of sensible nature, but we can only conceive of it by retaining in the memory that part of it which has already lapsed, so that, if the soul did not exist, time and movement would not be, i.e., with that unreal consistency, rational condition, with which our apprehension endows them. It is very important, as we shall see in the next chapter, to consider the part played in our knowledge by these rational beings founded in reality.